The fog clung to the hollows that morning like an old secret refusing to leave. In 1885, the ridges of Logan County, West Virginia, were not yet touched by the comfort of railroads or the hum of electricity. Life there was measured by the rhythm of pickaxes and the coughs that echoed from mine shafts. The town of Gray Hollow existed more as a scar in the forest than a settlement, a cluster of sagging cabins, a single church that leaned in the wind, and a general store run by a man who kept his ledger in whiskey stains. It was in this forgotten corner that a woman named Clara Mayfield lived, a widow not by choice but by consequence. Her husband, Samuel, had been swallowed by the earth 3 winters earlier when a tunnel collapsed beneath the Iron Ridge. They found his hat weeks later lodged in a coal vein, blackened by soot, his body never recovered. The mine sealed over him and the town moved on. But Clara did not. They said grief changes a person, but in Gray Hollow, grief was the only currency left. When Samuel's death cut off the family's income, Clara was left with 3 daughters, Ruth, age 16, Mary, 12, and little Eliza, barely 7. Their cabin stood by the creek's edge, where the water carried the smell of sulfur and the shimmer of coal dust. It was said that Clara could often be seen by that waterline at dusk, her hands still covered in the ash of her husband's clothes, scrubbing something invisible away. Neighbors pitied her at first, bringing baskets of cornbread or jars of canned beans, but pity fades faster than winter fires. In time, people stopped coming. What they didn't know, or didn't want to know, was that the widow had begun visiting the mine foreman, a man named Hollis Crane, whose name carried the weight of both fear and necessity in the region. Crane was not a miner himself. He was what they called a company man, overseeing quotas, wages, and the punishment of those who fell short. His wealth came not from the sweat of his brow, but from the bones of others. He lived above the town in a house built of imported brick, a red wound on the green hills. The men hated him but worked for him. The women feared him but sought him in secret when hunger outlasted pride. When Clara first came to his door, she wore her black shawl pulled so tight that her face looked carved from grief itself. She asked for work, any kind. He told her there was none for women, not in the mines, but she could scrub floors or clean linens. For a few weeks she did, until something shifted. The whispers began when people saw her daughters at his property. Not once, but several times, each time staying later, leaving quieter. At first, the town convinced itself that the girls were helping too, that the widow had found a kind of employment for them. But those who had lived long enough in coal country knew that charity from a man like Hollis Crane always came with a debt. By spring of 1886, Ruth stopped being seen at all. Mary and Eliza still walked to church, heads down, their dresses patched with fabric not from any store in Gray Hollow. Some said the widow had remarried in secret. Others said she'd made a covenant darker than marriage. Only the old preacher, Reverend Pike, dared confront her. He found her at her door one evening, a half-empty bottle by her side and eyes as hollow as the shafts her husband had died in. When he asked where Ruth was, she told him flatly, "She's gone to earn her keep." The Reverend left without another word. The following months were marked by strange occurrences in the hills. Hollis Crane began employing young women from neighboring towns, always through Clara's introduction. None of them lasted long. The miners spoke of screams that traveled through the tunnels at night, sounds that didn't belong to any man's throat. There were rumors that Crane was forcing the women into his private quarters under the pretext of company service, a phrase that in those days meant everything unholy. The mine company looked the other way. Profit, after all, had no conscience. But Clara's face began to change. Her cheeks hollowed, her eyes sharpened, and her voice, once gentle, took on the rhythm of command. Some swore she had struck a bargain, her daughter's virtue for her survival. Others said the devil himself had found a home in her grief. By the winter of 1887, Mary too was gone. The youngest, Eliza, wandered the fields talking to no one, her hair tangled and her hands perpetually dirty. When asked where her sisters had gone, she'd whisper, "Mama says they're deep in the dark." The phrase unsettled even the roughest of miners. The coal veins beneath Gray Hollow ran deep, stretching like veins of a sleeping beast beneath the hills. Sometimes when the men dug too far, they'd hear the drip of water or worse, the echo of something moving. It was during one of these shifts, 3 years after Ruth first vanished, that a team led by miner Thomas Greer broke into a sealed shaft left untouched since the accident that killed Samuel Mayfield. Inside, they found what looked at first like remnants of timber supports, But as they pulled away the debris, they uncovered bones, small bones, delicate, unmistakably human. The miners dropped their lamps. What the earth gave back that day was not coal, but truth. The coroner from Logan arrived a day later. The bones were retrieved, examined, and determined to belong to more than one person. The size and structure suggested young females. No official names were given, but in a town as small as Gray Hollow, no one needed confirmation. Clara's house was found empty the same evening. Her belongings were gone, the hearth cold. Only a trail of footprints led from the back door to the creek, ending at the waterline where she used to wash her husband's clothes. Some said she drowned herself. Others claimed she was seen days later walking into the woods with Hollis Crane. The mine company denied all knowledge, sealing the shaft again under orders from Crane himself. But silence has a way of fermenting into legend. Over the next few months, the miners began to report something strange underground. At night, when lanterns flickered and the air turned thick with coal dust, they swore they heard the sound of a woman weeping. Some said they saw the shape of a widow in black drifting through the tunnels, her face half buried in shadow, her hands outstretched. The mine lost 7 men that winter, each crushed, buried, or vanished without trace. The company blamed poor timbering. The miners blamed something else. They said the earth had finally remembered what had been buried inside it. News traveled slowly in those parts, but word reached Charleston by spring. A small investigative article appeared in the Wheeling Intelligencer, titled "Widow's Curse in Coal Hollow." It described the discovery of bones, the missing girls, and the company's quiet cover-up. But within a week, the story was retracted, the reporter dismissed. The official record would later list the incident as unsubstantiated. Still, oral memory clung where ink could not. Mothers warned their daughters not to wander near the mines. Men spit 3 times before entering a shaft, and in the years that followed, no one rebuilt on the land where Clara Mayfield's house had stood. Clara Mayfield's house had stood. In 1889, when the mine finally closed after a second collapse, surveyors clearing the land found an unmarked grave near the creek. The remains inside were that of an adult female, her fingers curled around a piece of fabric. Coal black burned at the edges, almost like a mourning shawl. No one claimed the body. The preacher, old and trembling, buried her beside the churchyard fence. "For the sins of the living," he murmured, "the earth collects its due." Whether she had truly sold her daughters or had been forced into something beyond her control, none could say. But the miners who had worked under Crane swore that after her death, the tunnels grew stiller, quieter, as though something restless had finally been fed. The company abandoned Gray Hollow soon after. Hollis Crane vanished, his house left empty and stripped by scavengers. Some said he fled to Pennsylvania. Others claimed he'd gone mad and thrown himself down a shaft. Decades later, a rusted locket was found near the mine entrance, engraved with the initials RM. Inside was a lock of hair and a single line scratched into the metal. Mama said light don't live long underground. The people of Gray Hollow dispersed, carrying with them the fragments of a story no one wanted to own. But long after the mines closed and the forest reclaimed the land, travelers through those ridges spoke of a sound that came with the mist, a soft humming, the kind a mother might make while rocking a child. And if one listened too long, it began to sound like digging. The year after the bones were found, Gray Hollow seemed to sink further into itself. What had once been a mining camp pretending to be a town became a shadow of both. The church bell, cracked from neglect, no longer rang. The storekeeper sold off his stock and left with his family under cover of fog. Even the children stopped playing near the creek, as though the water itself whispered names best forgotten. Yet for those who remained, the widowers, the crippled miners, the women who'd buried too much already, the story of Clara Mayfield became more than rumor. It became a mirror. People saw in her what they feared most, that hunger and grief could make a person betray the very flesh that tied them to this world. They said she had made her choice. But deep down, each one knew that choice was a word reserved for those who still had something left to bargain with. Before the widow's dealings with Hollis Crane, she had tried everything. The company script had lost its value. The meager life insurance her husband's death promised never came. She'd walked 10 miles to the company office in Logan, her hands blistered from clinging to the mule reins, only to be told that the death was unverified, since Samuel's body was never recovered. The man behind the desk offered her sympathy in one breath, and suggested alternative arrangements in the next. In a land where a woman's grief was often treated as an inconvenience, she learned that the only way to survive was to harden herself into something the world couldn't easily dismiss. The first winter without Samuel nearly killed them. She sold off his tools, their mule, even the iron stove. Her eldest daughter Ruth had begun taking washing jobs for miners' wives. Her delicate hands cracked and raw by 14. The little one, Eliza, stopped speaking for weeks after finding her mother crying into an empty plate. Then Hollis Crane came calling. Not in kindness, men like him rarely gave without expectation, but out of curiosity. He'd heard about the widow who refused to beg, who worked until her knuckles bled but never once asked for charity. He admired that kind of desperation. It reminded him of the miners who would crawl back underground a day after losing a finger, just to keep their wage. When he visited her cabin, he brought flour and tobacco, set them on her table without a word. She thanked him cautiously, sensing the trap even as she accepted the gift. He told her she could work at his estate, scrubbing floors, laundering sheets. She agreed, not out of trust, but necessity. The Crane estate stood at the top of Ridge Hill, a gaunt structure of imported brick that seemed to sneer at the cabins below. Inside it smelled of wealth and rot, of fine whiskey, coal smoke, and the perfume of women who had come before her. Clara scrubbed the floors until her back ached, listening to Crane's heavy boots pacing overhead. Sometimes he would descend the staircase just to watch her work. Other times he said nothing at all, just left coins on the table by the door. But what began as employment soon twisted into something else. One night when she was leaving, he told her to bring Ruth next time. The girl, he said, could help with sewing and laundry. She hesitated, but Ruth herself insisted. "If it means we eat, Mama, I'll go." Those were her words. A child's courage masking a world's cruelty. What followed could never be verified, only pieced together from what the miners whispered after too much drink and what Reverend Pike confessed on his deathbed years later. Ruth worked there for weeks before she disappeared. Hollis Crane claimed she'd left with a traveling peddler, chasing dreams beyond the mountains. But even as he said it, the miners knew better. They had seen her once through the slats of the coal carts, being led into the lower shafts where no woman ever went. Clara confronted Crane days later, but whatever words were exchanged between them remained buried. When she returned home, she was silent for 3 days. Then she began sending Mary up to the estate, and when Mary vanished too, she didn't speak at all. By the time Eliza was the only one left, the widow had become unrecognizable. Her hair turned silver despite her youth, her face etched with lines deeper than age alone could carve. Neighbors who once pitied her began to avoid her, crossing to the other side of the path when she approached. They said she had started carrying a small ledger. Hollis Crane's handwriting inside, each page marked with initials and amounts. No one knew what the numbers meant, but the implication was clear. There had been payment. Whether it was for labor, silence, or sin depended on who you asked. The preacher, Pike, visited her once more that spring. He found her staring into the hearth, the fire long burned out. "You can't wash the dark off your soul, Miss Mayfield," he said softly. She didn't look up. "Then maybe I'll bury it," she replied. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Days later, the mine exposed the bones, and whatever secrets had been half buried with them were torn into the open. Yet the townsfolk, bound by fear and dependence, said nothing. The company threatened dismissal for any who spread wild tales, and in a place where a man's livelihood hung by a thread of coal dust, silence was survival. Still, truth lingers like soot. It settles everywhere, even when swept away. As the years passed, Grey Hollow decayed, but the story of Clara Mayfield refused to die. Miners who transferred to neighboring camps carried it like a contagion. Some said the widow had traded her daughters willingly. Others said Crane forced her hand, threatening to seize her land or turn her out into the snow. A few even believed she'd done it out of delusion, convinced her girls would be spared the poverty that consumed her. Every version ended the same: bones in the earth, a widow gone, and the mines whispering back what they'd taken. There are records, half-rotted, written in trembling ink, of a coroner's report filed in Logan County that winter. The coroner, Jebediah Holt, described feminine remains of indeterminate age, fractured by mining tools. The report never mentioned names but listed an unusual detail: fragments of fabric consistent with mourning attire. Holt resigned 2 months later and moved north. His replacement sealed the file as resolved accidental discovery. Yet local men claimed they saw Crane himself at the burial, standing back as Reverend Pike muttered his prayer. His face, they said, looked pale as limestone, not from guilt perhaps, but from recognition, that the ground beneath him no longer belonged entirely to the living. In the following years, Crane's fortune dwindled. The mine's yield declined. Shafts collapsed without warning. One summer after a heavy rain, a section of the ridge caved in, revealing what miners swore was an open chamber. Timber supports warped, the air thick with rot. They refused to go near it. Those who did claimed they saw marks on the wall, handprints, small and dark, pressed into the stone as if made by something trying to claw its way out. The company sealed the entrance and posted guards for a week before abandoning the site altogether. By the next spring, Crane's house was shuttered, his windows boarded. Some said he'd fled west. Others said he drank himself to death in the cellar. But the mountain never forgot. Even after the mine closed for good, hunters passing through the hollows reported strange things. They'd find bones scattered in patterns like something had rearranged them after every storm. One man found a doll's head lodged between tree roots near the creek. Another claimed to hear a voice humming an old Appalachian lullaby that faded whenever he turned. When archaeologists later visited in the 1920s to map abandoned coal towns, they noted unusual magnetic readings near the ridge, strong enough to distort compasses. Locals joked it was the widow calling her girls home. It is easy from a modern distance to see Clara Mayfield as monstrous. To imagine her standing at that creek, bartering her daughters to a man like Crane. But in the logic of Gray Hollow, the logic of hunger, grief and patriarchal ruin, monstrosity was not a choice but a condition of survival. A woman without a husband had no property rights, no wage, no power. Her worth existed only in what she could give away, and so she did piece by piece until there was nothing left but legend. By piece until there was nothing left but legend. Over time, her name vanished from the records. Her cabin rotted into earth and the forest reclaimed the mines. Yet every few years when heavy rains tore at the soil, bones surfaced again. Small, pale, impossible to date. Each discovery renewed the story. Each story grew darker. Some swore her ghost wandered the ridge carrying a lantern that never cast light, calling softly for the children she could never bury. Others said she was not a ghost at all, but the land itself mourning what it had consumed. And so, a century later, when a small team from Charleston University came to survey the old mine for geological study, they found themselves tracing the same paths miners once walked by lamplight. Their instruments recorded low-frequency vibrations under the sealed shafts, too steady to be natural tremors. One researcher, reading through old ledgers in the archives, found Hollis Crane's payroll records. The final entry, dated December 1888, listed a single payment underlined twice, C. Mayfield, settlement rendered. No amount, no signature, just 2 words scrawled in coal-black ink. It was enough to send them back to the ridge with renewed attention. They found remnants of an old graveyard, unmarked stones, a cross carved crudely from birch. Beneath the largest stone lay rusted iron fragments, possibly coffin hinges. And in the dirt, mixed with coal dust, were small pieces of fabric still faintly black. Samples were sent to the lab, but before results could be analyzed, the team withdrew. Their notes mention unease among locals and equipment malfunctions due to magnetism. But one field journal contained a single line that felt like an echo from another century. The ground still breathes. Sometimes it whispers. Even now, on certain nights, the people who live near what remains of Gray Hollow claim to hear shovels clinking under the soil, a soft hum carried by the wind through the abandoned shafts. They say if you follow it, it leads you down toward the creek, where the water runs black after rain, and the earth gives up what it cannot keep. Before the mines, before the debts and the bones and the stories whispered by firelight, Hollis Crane had been a boy from Fayette County, the son of a surveyor who chased seams of coal through the mountains like veins of gold. His father taught him how to read land, the folds of ridges, the pitch of a valley, the scent of water hidden beneath rock. But he never taught him conscience. When his father drank himself to death in a Charleston tavern, Hollis was 15. By 20, he had become what his father never managed to be, not a man who knew the land, but a man who owned it. He came to Gray Hollow with investors from Pittsburgh, sent to turn the mountain into profit. They brought with them company scrip, store debt, and a promise that every man could earn his salvation with a pickaxe. In truth, they built a prison of labor, disguised as progress. Crane was the warden who smiled. He had a way of making cruelty sound like business. "We all dig for something," he used to say, tapping his chest with a gloved finger. "Some for coal, some for comfort." The miners laughed when he said it, though none of them dared question which he sought. Hollis was tall, meticulous, always in a coat too fine for the dust that covered everything else. He carried a gold watch engraved with the phrase Tempus Tollit Omnia, time takes all things. The irony of it seemed to please him. In company records, his signature appeared beside dozens of names. Miners dead, miners fined, miners vanished. And yet he kept the mine running. Output increased. Profits doubled. The company saw only numbers. The men underground saw a man who could damn them with a single word. By the time Clara Mayfield's husband worked under him, Crane had perfected his method of control. He called it discipline by hunger. Pay the men barely enough to survive and they'd never risk rebellion. Deny a widow her husband's death benefit, and you reminded every living worker who truly owned their lives. When Samuel Mayfield died in the collapse, Crane's report labeled it avoidable negligence, a convenient phrase that shifted blame to the dead. He filed the papers, closed the shaft, and moved on. But Clara didn't. She appeared at his office a month later, her shawl drawn tight, holding Samuel's pay stub like a death certificate. He dismissed her claim, yet something in her refusal to weep unsettled him. In a world full of broken women, she was stone. That defiance intrigued him first. It corrupted him later. Hollis Crane's appetite was not born from lust alone. It was the hunger of a man who mistook domination for proof of existence. Power was his only measure of worth. The mine gave it to him, but only through suffering. So when he found a woman like Clara, sharp, proud, desperate, he saw in her the perfect reflection of what he believed the mountain itself to be, a thing that must break before it yielded its riches. Those who knew him said he liked to walk the tunnels after midnight, lantern in hand, alone. "The mountain talks if you listen long enough," he'd say. The miners thought it madness. Some claimed they saw him whispering into the rock, tracing his fingers along the walls like reading scripture. But when the first shaft collapsed again in 1887, killing 7, Crane blamed the foreman and doubled the quotas. To him, every death was an acceptable cost. When the bones were unearthed 3 years later, he didn't flinch. He paid the coroner. He silenced the miners. He closed the records. But power erodes the soul slowly, like water through limestone. Each night he began hearing things, soft scraping from the cellar, the sound of shovels echoing through the walls. He dismissed it as rats until one night, descending to his wine cellar, he found his lantern flicker and die. In that silence, he swore he heard a girl humming. He stood there for minutes, frozen, the sound curling around him like breath. The next day, he ordered the cellar sealed. Servants quit soon after, complaining of voices of footsteps in empty rooms. The estate, once filled with company men and laughter, became a mausoleum of whispers. Reverend Pike visited him once that winter at the insistence of the miners. The preacher found him pale, hands trembling, eyes hollow. Crane confessed that sometimes when the wind shifted through the mines, he could hear his own name whispered from the dark. "They're not gone," he said. "They're beneath us, listening." Pike urged repentance, but Crane laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "There's no forgiveness in the earth," he said. "Only debt." When the preacher left, he found the door to the mine office nailed shut. By 1888, the company began to lose faith in him. Reports of sabotage circulated. Miners refused to work night shifts. Some claimed to see figures moving at the edge of the tunnels, women barefoot, faces obscured by soot. One worker, a boy of 17, fled screaming, saying he'd seen a woman carrying light that gave no light at all. Crane dismissed him publicly, but privately, he began to unravel. He wrote letters to the company board insisting that forces of decay were undermining production. His words grew strange, half business, half confession. "We have mined too deep," one line read, and struck the heart of something that remembers. After Clara vanished, he stopped leaving the estate altogether. His servants deserted him. His meals went untouched. Those who lived nearby said they saw a single lamp burning in his study every night until dawn. Then one morning the light went out and never returned. When the sheriff's men finally forced the door, they found the house empty except for ledgers scattered across the floor, each page filled with the same line written over and over. She paid in full. There was no body, no trace of Crane. Only the cellar wall showed signs of fresh plaster, too smooth to match the rest. What no one realized at the time was that the mine and the estate were connected by an old ventilation shaft, carved decades earlier. When the company later surveyed the property, they discovered it sealed from both ends, cement poured hastily, uneven. Inside the narrow passage, bones were found again, this time adult, the skull fractured. The coroner recorded them as indeterminate human remains. Some believed they belonged to Crane. Others thought the mountain had simply claimed one more debt. But the sickness he brought to Grey Hollow didn't end with him. The miners carried it, an inheritance of silence. Their children grew up with the stories, but without the means to escape them. The coal companies came and went. The land stayed wounded. In the 1920s, when West Virginia historians began collecting oral accounts from mining towns, the tale of the widow and the bones appeared in multiple versions. In some, Crane was the devil himself. In others, he was just a man, proof that hell can look like a ledger and speak like opportunity. Yet the most haunting part wasn't the story's gore, but its pattern. Historians found that throughout Appalachia, similar stories existed. Women sold, lost, or silenced under the machinery of coal. Each town had its widow, its ghost, its reckoning buried in the shafts. Clara Mayfield's tragedy became less an anomaly than a symbol, a testament to what happens when poverty, patriarchy, and industrial hunger fuse into one unstoppable force. In the official narrative of American progress, these women were footnotes. In the oral record, they were warnings. Decades later, a sociologist named Caroline Harker visited the remnants of Grey Hollow while researching coal-era folklore. She found only stone foundations, shards of pottery, and the remains of the old mine entrances. Local accounts guided her to the creek. There, amid overgrowth, she unearthed a rusted locket, the same one later catalogued at the Charleston Historical Museum. The inscription matched the initials of Ruth Mayfield. Inside, the hair still clung to the hinge, fused by time and moisture. But what caught her attention was the faint imprint of another engraving, almost worn away. "Forgive me." She published her findings in 1932, calling it The Widow's Bargain. Her paper was largely ignored, dismissed as superstition dressed in scholarship. Yet her private notes, discovered after her death, told a different story. She claimed to have heard on her last night in Grey Hollow what sounded like 3 knocks beneath her cabin floor, followed by the faint sound of shoveling. It is easy to dismiss such accounts as imagination, but in the mountains of West Virginia, imagination has always been a form of memory. The land keeps what history erases. Even now, deep under the regrown forest, the old tunnels remain. Their entrances collapsed, their maps forgotten. The ground above them swells and sinks with the seasons, breathing faintly like something half asleep. Geologists studying soil subsidence have measured rhythmic shifts, small, regular, like the heartbeat of something buried alive. They explain it as pressure changes. The locals have another word for it: repentance. The story of Hollis Crane and the widow who bartered with despair is not merely one of sin and punishment. It is the anatomy of a wound, how power digs itself into the flesh of a place, how silence buries truth until the earth itself must spit it out. The miners who once dug for coal believed they were uncovering wealth. In time, they learned they were digging through the bones of their own history. And so when the last shafts caved and the companies moved north, they left behind not just ruins, but an inheritance of unease, a remnant that no debt paid in flesh ever truly settles. And if, on certain nights, a traveler stands by that creek and hears the soft murmur of wind through the hollows, it's easy to imagine the voices overlapping, the widow, the daughters, the man who mistook ownership for salvation, all bound together in the soil that remembers everything. The mines may be sealed, the town erased, but the mountain still hums. And what it hums, some say, sounds like the rhythm of shovels working slow and steady, forever uncovering what men tried so hard to bury. Grey Hollow, by the late 1880s, had become a place where time itself seemed to fold inward, collapsing past, present, and the unspoken into one suffocating shadow. The town had once been modestly alive, a scattering of log cabins, a blacksmith, a general store, and the small church where Reverend Pike had tried to teach the community that faith could outweigh fear. But after the disappearance of Clara Mayfield's daughters and the grim revelations of the mine, those institutions, fragile as they were, began to crumble. The church bell rang fewer times each Sunday, its sound hesitant, almost apologetic, as if even iron could sense the weight of sin that had passed beneath it. The pews, once crowded with families, held only a handful of congregants who sat rigidly, avoiding eye contact. Their prayers whispered as though their words could be stolen if spoken too loudly. The preacher, too, grew silent in public, leaving only the rustle of hymn books and the occasional shuffle of boots across floorboards to mark the passing hours. The moral fabric of Grey Hollow had been rent not by a single act, but by the accumulation of necessity, fear, and complicity. When a widow is forced to choose between her children and her survival, when miners are driven to the tunnels knowing their lives might be claimed by collapse, the line between victim and perpetrator blurs. The people understood this instinctively. They did not speak of Clara Mayfield in the marketplace, nor did they share the details of Hollis Crane's transactions openly. Yet in quiet corners, over dwindling cups of coffee or whiskey diluted with water, the stories circulated in fragments. Mothers warned their daughters with code. Do not linger near the mine, do not accept gifts from strangers, do not trust the men who own your father's livelihoods. Fathers spoke in half-truths, recounting accidents in the shafts but leaving out names, dates, and the evidence that might have condemned those responsible. Silence in Grey Hollow was both shield and shackle. Despite their efforts to maintain civility, the town could not escape the transformation that had taken root in its soil. The mines, now partially abandoned, exhaled a scent of decay that clung to every surface. Timber supports groaned under unseen pressure. Shafts were lined with coal dust so fine it entered lungs like smoke, invisible but lethal. At night, the wind carried strange sounds through the hollows, the scraping of rocks, the sighing of timber, and sometimes the soft wail of voices that might have been human. Children who ventured too close to the creek at dusk returned with pallid faces and unspoken terror. Women spoke of dreams where figures in black watched them from the shadows of the ridge. Even the men, who had grown accustomed to danger in the mines, began to tread more lightly, their instincts telling them that some threats were beyond the reach of pickaxes and hammers. Reverend Pike, aged now and weary from years of preaching into a hollowed-out congregation, saw the decay not only in the town structures but in its collective conscience. He had tried to counsel Clara Mayfield once, urging her to trust in God rather than men. He had witnessed the desperation in her eyes, the stubborn defiance, and he had felt the weight of powerlessness press down on him like the very coal under their feet. Later, he attempted to challenge Crane directly, to appeal to what shred of morality might remain, only to be met with polite dismissal and veiled threat. The preacher's sermons grew somber, his voice tinged with a sorrow that seemed to seep into the pews and settle over the town like a lingering fog. On Sundays, his calls for forgiveness were met with nods that never reached the eyes of his congregation. The people had learned that survival often demanded compromise, and compromise in Grey Hollow carried a price too heavy to name. The Mayfield tragedy became a silent marker in the town's consciousness, a cautionary tale cloaked in ambiguity. Clara Mayfield herself, whether by choice or coercion, had stepped beyond the boundaries of what the community could comprehend. Her disappearance only intensified the unease. Windows of her cabin, now rotting and overrun with moss, were boarded or shuttered by neighbors. The land around her home grew wild, the creek swelling in heavy rains to wash away traces of human habitation. Yet the memory lingered. Local children would dare one another to peek through the brush where her cabin had stood, only to run screaming when the wind shifted, carrying faint echoes of a lullaby half-remembered. Adults, when pressed, claimed it was the wind, the creek, or their imagination. But in the hush of night, the old miners swore they could hear small, deliberate movements from the earth, scraping, shuffling, as though the ground itself were arranging something hidden. The mines, both literal and symbolic, became the axis around which the town's collective fear revolved. Men who once took pride in their labor now approached the shafts with trepidation, their hands trembling when handling the ropes and lamps that had once been familiar tools. Some carried talismans or charms, claiming the mountain required appeasement. Others simply muttered prayers to gods long abandoned by industrial logic. The shafts, dark and silent to casual inspection, held within them a history the town could not fully acknowledge. Bones, fabric, and the faint residue of desperation pressed into every crevice. Those who stumbled upon fragments, an odd piece of cloth, a small bone protruding from the dirt, often buried them again, fearing that unearthing them would draw the curse closer. In this way, Grey Hollow became a town simultaneously living above and haunted beneath its soil, the duality of life and death entwined in a pattern too intricate for ordinary understanding. Among the surviving residents, stories of Clara Mayfield evolved into something more than mere recollection. They became ritual, a way of maintaining coherence in a fractured community. Men whispered about the widow's bargain when drunk, embellishing details with each retelling, though none dared link her directly to the company men openly. Women spoke in hushed tones to their daughters, using metaphor to convey the lesson of survival without naming the act. The forest takes what is left unattended, and the earth remembers everything. Children, growing up amid this mythology, carried both fascination and fear, internalizing the weight of transgression and the consequences of silence. The town, in essence, became a living memorial, its culture shaped less by law or religion than by the spectral traces of unspoken atrocity. Yet, paradoxically, the town's decline did not go entirely unnoticed by outsiders. Occasional travelers, surveyors, and geologists passed through, remarking on the rugged beauty of the ridge and the seeming isolation of the community. They did not, however, remain long enough to comprehend the layered history embedded in the landscape. Reports from these outsiders often noted the unusual patterns of vegetation, the subtle depressions in the ground that hinted at former shafts, and the ever-present haze of coal dust that settled over everything. But the true story, the story of desperation, barter, and betrayal, remained largely invisible to the eyes untrained to see what the mountain had consumed. In the decades that followed, as industrialization spread through Appalachia and mines opened in more accessible regions, Grey Hollow's remnants served as a cautionary tale. Scholars researching the socioeconomics of the coal country often cited anecdotal accounts of the Mayfield incident as evidence of the complex interplay between poverty, gender, and power. Women's vulnerability, miners' exploitation, and company control over the land created conditions in which moral compromise became almost inevitable. Clara Mayfield's story, while horrific in its particulars, was emblematic of broader systemic failings, an individual tragedy magnified by structural inequity. Yet the emotional resonance of the tale persisted precisely because it was never fully recorded, leaving room for speculation, fear, and moral reflection to fill the gaps. Even the physical landscape bore witness to the town's decline. Trees grew thick and gnarled over the abandoned mines, their roots entwined with forgotten timbers. The creek that once marked the edge of human habitation now ran dark with silt and runoff, carrying the faintest echoes of past labor and suffering. Wild animals, deer, foxes, and the occasional bear, moved through the area with a presumption that humans had long since abandoned dominion. And beneath it all, the earth retained memory. Storms would sometimes expose fragments of coal, fragments of bone, small pieces of fabric fused with dirt. The past, like the mountain itself, could not be fully erased. As Grey Hollow faded from maps and memory, the narrative of Clara Mayfield, her daughters, and Hollis Crane evolved into both warning and myth. It became the story adults told to children to instill caution, to instill respect for the mountain, and to underscore the fragility of life when power and poverty intersect. The tale's endurance owes as much to fear as it does to fascination. For every scholar, preacher, or miner who tried to analyze it in terms of morality or legality, there existed the deeper, almost elemental truth. The earth preserves what humans try to bury, and silence has a cost. Those who trespassed on its lessons, those who ignored the shadow of past transgressions, found that it could exact repayment in subtle, unrelenting ways. And so, Grey Hollow, though largely abandoned by the end of the 19th century, remained a site of significance. Its ruins told a story of desperation and consequence, of moral compromise under duress, and of the human tendency to look away when survival demands compromise. The story of the widow, her daughters, and the company man who leveraged both grief and hunger was embedded not only in local lore, but in the very soil, coal, and creek beds that shaped the town's geography. To those who came later, the hollow appeared as nothing more than an overgrown landscape. But to those who listened closely, It whispered the memory of choices made under impossible circumstances, echoing the principle that every human action, no matter how concealed, leaves an imprint on the world. Even as the physical structures of Grey Hollow decayed and the mines fell silent, the psychological imprint of Clara Mayfield's choices and the crimes entwined with Hollis Crane lingered for decades. Families who had remained in the region carried the story as a quiet, unspoken inheritance, a shadow that shaped behavior and belief in ways both subtle and profound. Miners' sons and daughters grew up hearing fragments of the tale, a warning not just about a single widow, but about the treacherous intersection of poverty, desperation, and male authority. Those fragments passed from generation to generation, took on the qualities of folklore, but with a weight grounded in evidence: the bones unearthed in the mines, the sealed shafts, the accounts of workers who had glimpsed the truth and paid for their silence. What outsiders dismissed as superstition was, for locals, a daily reminder of human vulnerability under systems designed to exploit it. The mountains themselves seemed to conspire with memory. Rainfall would erode sections of the old shafts, revealing occasional fragments of coal-blackened bone, shards of clothing, or splintered timber, all testaments to lives consumed beneath the weight of industry and greed. These occasional discoveries reinforced the narrative, compelling the community to maintain vigilance over the land and the stories it held. Even well-meaning archaeologists and historians, when conducting surveys decades later, were met with warnings from local elders: cryptic, wary guidance that the earth retains what is owed, and those who dig carelessly may find themselves confronted by more than geology. In this way, Grey Hollow became both a literal and symbolic graveyard, preserving the consequences of transgression alongside the memory of systemic oppression. The descendants of the original miners, particularly those whose families had lost daughters, wives, and sisters, carried with them a sense of inherited responsibility and trauma. They recounted not only what had been taken, but how the town itself had failed to intervene. Some of the younger generation chose to leave, moving to industrial centers or cities to escape the weight of memory. Others stayed, compelled by duty, poverty, or stubborn attachment to the land. These narratives shaped entire communities' understanding of morality, authority, and survival. Children were warned from an early age about the dangers of trusting outsiders, the potential cruelty of men in power, and the unspoken cost of silence. In this way, Clara Mayfield's actions, while tragic and morally complex, functioned as a lens through which subsequent generations understood the fragility of life in the mountains. The company that had once employed Crane and profited from the labor of Grey Hollow's residents eventually collapsed under financial mismanagement and the declining viability of its mines. Yet even in the absence of the company, the social dynamics it had established persisted. Those who remained, primarily women and older miners, continued to navigate a world where trust was scarce and the consequences of misjudgment were severe. Every small transaction, selling eggs at the market, bartering for wood, or lending labor, was weighed against the lessons embedded in local memory. Desperation can erode boundaries, and power unchecked can corrode both the individual and the community. Clara Mayfield, in this context, became a figure both reviled and pitied, a tragic embodiment of choices forced by circumstance, yet magnified by social inequities. By the early 20th century, Grey Hollow was no longer a living town. Its buildings had succumbed to rot, its roads overgrown with weeds, and its mines sealed, partially by human hands and partially by the inexorable reclaiming of the earth. Yet the land itself remained a repository of memory. Botanists and naturalists visiting the area noted the peculiar growth patterns along the old mining shafts. Certain plants thrived in ways that seemed almost unnatural, their roots disturbed by hidden cavities and residual coal dust. Geologists mapped the terrain and recorded unusual subsidence patterns, as though the earth beneath retained not only physical remnants but echoes of the labor, fear, and suffering imposed upon it. In a subtle, almost poetic sense, Grey Hollow's decline became a testament to the enduring consequences of human action, and the land itself a silent witness to what had transpired within its hollows. In the realm of local folklore, the story of Clara Mayfield and Hollis Crane evolved in response to the passage of time. Oral traditions emphasized moral lessons, the dangers of greed, the ethical costs of survival, and the invisible weight of human choices. Children were told to respect the land, not merely for its utility but because it retained memory. Miners' tales blended reality with the supernatural, recounting visions of small figures moving along ridges at twilight or hearing faint humming from beneath the earth. Though some dismissed these stories as exaggeration, they were consistent across decades and appeared in multiple accounts, suggesting a persistent cultural recognition of past transgressions. In this sense, the supernatural element functioned less as fantasy and more as a cultural mechanism for processing collective trauma, preserving the memory of Grey Hollow's complex moral landscape. Academics studying Appalachia in the 1920s and 1930s occasionally referenced Grey Hollow as a case study in the interplay of economic exploitation, gendered vulnerability, and community complicity. While official records remained sparse, anthropologists and sociologists were able to reconstruct partial narratives through interviews, oral histories, and surviving documents. They noted that the Mayfield tragedy exemplified a broader pattern. Women were systematically marginalized, miners' lives were commodified, and the legal and corporate structures provided little recourse for victims. These analyses highlighted the structural conditions that made Clara Mayfield's decisions simultaneously incomprehensible, tragic, and historically explicable. In many ways, the story became emblematic of the dark underbelly of industrialization, where profit and necessity intersected to produce situations of profound ethical ambiguity. The physical remnants of Grey Hollow continued to exert a psychological influence on subsequent generations. As the mountains reforested and wildlife returned, the hollows themselves retained an eerie presence. Travelers occasionally reported the faint sounds of scraping, shifting, or faint humming from the old mine shafts. Residents living near the site spoke of subtle vibrations underfoot, inexplicable depressions in the soil, and recurring nightmares tied to the landscape. While these phenomena could be dismissed as natural or coincidental, the consistency of reports across decades lent them a weight that challenged simple rational explanation. The land, in essence, had become a vessel of memory, its physical and psychological characteristics intertwined with the events that had transpired within it. By mid-century, Grey Hollow's story had been woven into the broader Appalachian narrative as a symbol of the human costs of industrial expansion. It became the subject of regional literature, newspaper retrospectives, and local folklore collections. Writers and journalists emphasized the haunting, cautionary aspects of the tale, the widow's desperation, the company man's exploitation, and the ultimate revelation of human remains in the abandoned mines. While interpretations varied, some focusing on moral failure, others on systemic oppression, the core story remained strikingly consistent. Clara Mayfield's legacy, morally complex and tragic, continued to resonate as a lens through which the community and outsiders alike could examine the consequences of unchecked power, ethical compromise, and the enduring memory of trauma embedded in both people and landscape. Even today, the memory of Grey Hollow serves as a cautionary reflection on the ways in which economic systems, social hierarchies, and environmental realities intersect. The town's decline, the disappearance of its residents, and the eventual uncovering of bones decades later illustrate the long-term consequences of human actions compounded by structural inequities. Clara Mayfield's choices, whether judged as survival, sin, or desperation, exemplify the ethical complexity that arises when human beings are confronted with impossible circumstances. And the mountain itself, silently reclaiming the town, continues to bear witness, a timeless repository of memory, caution, and the weight of history that refuses to be forgotten. Long after the last miners had left Grey Hollow, and the crumbling cabins surrendered to forest and frost, the whispers of what had occurred lingered as if carried in the wind itself. Travelers along the ridges spoke in hushed tones of the place where the widow had lived, where the daughters had vanished, and where the mines had spat forth their grim testimony years later. Some claimed that even decades after the town's abandonment, one could hear the faint scraping of tools from beneath the earth, like the slow, deliberate labor of hands that refused to rest. Others swore that the creek, which had once marked the boundary of human habitation, sometimes carried a faint lullaby over the water, a melody half remembered, half fabricated, sung by a voice that was neither living nor entirely dead. The phenomena were inconsistent, ephemeral, but consistent enough to embed Grey Hollow firmly in the landscape of regional legend, a locus where memory, trauma, and the land itself intertwined in ways that defied easy interpretation. The testimonies of those who remained or had moved on became increasingly central to understanding the town's moral and social collapse. Older miners spoke of the days before Clara Mayfield's daughters were taken, when the rhythm of labor and life was harsh but predictable. They described long hours underground, the constant threat of cave-ins, the smell of coal dust clinging to skin and clothing, and the occasional communal celebrations in the log cabins after a particularly successful shift. These were days of brutal labor, yes, but also of camaraderie and shared resilience. Then came the slow intrusion of Crane's authority into private lives, a man who measured worth in obedience, in submission, in the quiet erosion of moral choice. Miners recalled how Crane's presence in the community coincided with increased absenteeism, the spread of fear and a peculiar heaviness in the air, as if the mountains themselves were recoiling from his decisions. The widow's involvement, and the way she navigated the impossible demands placed upon her, became a point of moral reckoning for the surviving townsfolk. In whispered conversations, men debated whether Clara had been victim or agent, and women speculated on what they themselves would have done under similar circumstances. Some argued she had acted out of maternal desperation, sacrificing what she could to preserve what little remained of her family. Others insisted that no need could justify the abandonment of children to the hands of a man like Crane. These debates were never resolved. They became ritualized as a form of communal processing, a moral exercise performed to keep the past alive and to frame the town's understanding of right and wrong within the context of survival and coercion. Miners, who had witnessed the early arrivals of Crane's influence, recalled the shifts in labor conditions and the subtle changes in town dynamics. Small favors, like the distribution of coal or access to the general store, became instruments of control. Families dependent on his largesse were compelled into silence, their complicity secured by fear and need. Those who resisted found themselves marginalized, threatened, or outright expelled. The mechanisms of power were subtle but pervasive: a withheld pay stub, a closed ledger, a whispered rumor that a family had moved on under mysterious circumstances. The cumulative effect was the same: a town conditioned to obey, to conceal, and to internalize moral compromises as necessities of survival. Over time, Grey Hollow's decay extended beyond the physical and moral to the symbolic. The abandoned cabins, collapsing under moss and vine, became monuments to decisions made under duress. Each fractured wall and roofless chimney told the story of lives constrained by poverty and exploitation. The creeks, swollen with seasonal rain, reflected not only sunlight but the shadow of grief carried by generations. The mountains, scarred by tunnels and tailings, bore witness to labor extracted at the cost of human life and dignity. These symbols endured even as the town's living memory faded, offering later observers a tangible sense of the moral and emotional terrain that had shaped the Mayfield tragedy. Folklore surrounding the widow and the mines continued to develop in the decades following the town's abandonment. Local storytellers recounted encounters with spectral figures: a woman walking the ridge with a lantern, children's laughter echoing through abandoned shafts, or the fleeting glimpse of pale hands pressing against timber supports in collapsed tunnels. These tales functioned on multiple levels: as entertainment, as cautionary allegory, and as mechanisms for communal remembrance. They reinforced the lessons learned by earlier generations, preserving the psychological and ethical weight of events that had occurred in the absence of formal documentation or legal resolution. The persistence of these stories illustrates the human tendency to inscribe memory into landscape, transforming geography into a living archive of experience, morality, and trauma. Anthropologists visiting the region in the early 20th century noted that such legends were deeply intertwined with tangible evidence. Fragments of bone, pieces of clothing, rusted tools, and partially collapsed tunnels. They observed that local accounts, though varying in detail, consistently emphasized the same core elements: a widow making an impossible choice, the exploitation of miners and their families, the presence of a man wielding power unchecked, and the eventual discovery of human remains in the mines. The consistency suggested that the community's oral record, despite its folkloric embellishments, preserved essential truths about the events and their consequences. Researchers concluded that Grey Hollow exemplified the ways in which memory, morality, and landscape intersected in Appalachian communities, particularly in the context of industrial exploitation. By mid-century, Grey Hollow had become a site of both historical interest and lingering unease. Field researchers, journalists, and casual visitors noted the persistence of unusual phenomena: low-frequency vibrations in the earth near old mine shafts, sudden collapses of partially hidden tunnels, and unexplainable anomalies in the soil where remains had once been interred. Scientific explanations, subsidence, erosion, or residual coal activity, could not fully account for the precise alignment of disturbances with historical sites of tragedy. The interpretation of these phenomena varied, but for locals they reinforced the moral and emotional resonance of the town's past. Grey Hollow was a landscape that remembered both literally and figuratively, a community whose collective conscience had been tested and fractured by circumstances beyond their control. The psychological resonance extended to subsequent generations as well. Descendants of miners, widows, and other townsfolk reported recurring dreams, unease when near the site, and inexplicable fear or awe when discussing the past. Such manifestations, while subjective, indicate the long-lasting imprint of trauma on community memory and individual psychology. Historians have since noted that Grey Hollow serves as an example of intergenerational transmission of trauma, wherein the events of a single generation continue to influence the beliefs, behaviors, and emotional responses of later descendants. In this context, Clara Mayfield's actions and the consequences of the mine's exposure of human remains function as a nexus through which collective memory, ethical reflection, and inherited trauma converge. Even contemporary studies of the region have acknowledged the symbolic significance of Grey Hollow. The town exemplifies the intersection of gendered vulnerability, labor exploitation, and environmental memory. Clara Mayfield's story, once confined to rumor and oral tradition, is now understood as part of a larger historical narrative, a portrait of Appalachian life where survival often required moral compromise, where corporate authority could overshadow community norms, and where the land itself retained evidence of human suffering. The spectral echoes reported in the area, whether perceived as supernatural or as psychological manifestations, serve to reinforce the enduring moral and emotional weight of events that occurred over a century ago. The story of Grey Hollow, in essence, demonstrates that history is not merely a record of dates, names, and events. It is embedded in landscapes, in the behaviors of communities, and in the consciousness of subsequent generations. The widow who sold her daughters, the man who exploited labor and authority, and the miners who navigated their impossible circumstances all contribute to a complex moral ecology. Even after the town's physical erasure, this ecology persists, offering insight into the consequences of human action, the capacity for both cruelty and resilience, and the ways in which memory, whether preserved in documents, oral tradition, or the land itself, shapes our understanding of past events. Grey Hollow remains, in a sense, alive. Its forests conceal foundations, its creeks murmur secrets, and its ridges carry the echo of decisions that forever altered the lives of its inhabitants. The mountains, with their scars of mining and the hidden chambers of human remains, continue to bear witness. And those who approach with knowledge of the story, or who stumble upon it unknowingly, find themselves confronted not only with a historical record, but with the moral weight of a place where desperation, power, and survival intersected in tragic and unforgettable ways. Grey Hollow, by the final decades of the 20th century, existed almost entirely in the realm of memory, myth, and the faint traces of geography. The cabins were gone, the mines sealed or collapsed, and the roads overtaken by underbrush. Yet the town's legacy endured in ways far more enduring than timber or stone. Those who grew up hearing the stories of the widow and her daughters carried them forward into the modern age, retelling them as cautionary tales, moral exemplars, and, for some, warnings of the subtle yet persistent power of human greed. Anthropologists, historians, and folklorists who visited the site found that even without physical structures, Grey Hollow exerted a presence, an emotional resonance that permeated memory, community, and even the landscape itself. The mountains, scarred by extraction and imbued with human tragedy, held the story in their very soil, allowing it to echo across generations. The discovery of bones in the abandoned mines decades after Clara Mayfield's desperate choices added layers of tangible proof to the oral traditions that had been preserved. These discoveries, though sporadic and fragmentary, acted as markers confirming what locals had long whispered. Every small excavation, every piece of coal-stained bone reinforced the narrative of suffering, moral compromise, and the human cost of industrial exploitation. Researchers and journalists documented these findings, often framing them within broader discussions of Appalachian labor history, gendered vulnerability, and social inequality. Yet the bones were more than evidence, they were symbols. Each fragment told of lives caught between survival and morality, of women whose desperation met the cold calculus of profit, and of a town that struggled to bear witness to its own complicity. As the decades passed, the story of Gray Hollow evolved from local folklore into a cautionary legend with moral, psychological, and sociological significance. Communities across West Virginia referenced it when discussing the consequences of unchecked corporate power, the ethical dilemmas imposed by poverty, and the enduring impact of trauma. Clara Mayfield, once vilified or pitied depending on perspective, became a figure whose life and choices exemplified the difficult interplay between agency and coercion. She was both victim and agent, embodying the painful truths that survival often demands compromise, that moral clarity is a luxury in context defined by scarcity and threat, and that human decisions, even when desperate, resonate across time. The miner's descendants, now scattered throughout the Appalachian region and beyond, carried the story as a psychological inheritance. Many reported recurring dreams or unease when in proximity to the site, suggesting that the events of the ECA past were not confined to the historical record, but continued to influence the collective consciousness. This intergenerational transmission of trauma underscores the persistent effect of systemic injustice and human exploitation, revealing how historical events, particularly those involving power imbalance and ethical compromise, can shape community and individual psychology long after the physical circumstances have passed. Gray Hollow thus serves as a case study in the ways trauma, memory, and morality intersect and endure. Physical remnants of the town and the mines also contributed to the narrative's persistence. Botanists observed unusual plant growth over old shaft entrances, a subtle yet consistent sign of underground disturbance. Soil surveys revealed depressions and subsidence, evidence of the voids created by mining and the long-term structural instability left in the wake of extraction. These traces, though scientific in nature, carried symbolic weight. The land itself bore witness to the ethical and physical consequences of human action. The landscape, scarred and unsettled, reminded visitors that the decisions made in desperation, cruelty, or negligence are never entirely erased. They persist in both memory and material form, linking past and present in a continuum of moral and environmental consequence. The spectral accounts surrounding Gray Hollow, stories of voices in the wind, faint lights at night, and fleeting figures on the ridges, continued to be reported well into the 20th century. While some dismissed these occurrences as products of imagination or local folklore, their consistency across decades suggested a more complex interplay between memory, environment, and perception. Scholars of folklore and psychology note that such phenomena often emerge in places where trauma and unresolved moral tension are concentrated, functioning as cultural mechanisms to preserve and process memory. In Gray Hollow, the land, the stories, and the psychological echoes formed a network of remembrance, ensuring that the events and lessons of the past were not easily forgotten. The broader social and ethical implications of the Gray Hollow narrative extend beyond the local context. Clara Mayfield's story illuminates the ways in which systemic oppression, economic necessity, and patriarchal authority can converge to limit human agency, creating situations in which moral compromise is inevitable. Hollis Crane, representing corporate and male authority, exemplifies the exploitation and calculation that often accompany economic expansion in resource-rich but socially vulnerable regions. Their interaction, tragic and morally complex, reflects a historical reality repeated across Appalachia and other industrial frontiers, where laborers, particularly women, faced impossible choices and often bore the consequences of decisions imposed upon them. By the late 20th century, Gray Hollow became more than a historical curiosity. It emerged as a symbol and moral touchstone. Folklorists collected oral histories, documenting the subtle shifts in narrative across generations. Writers and Journalists explored the story in the context of labor history, social justice, and Appalachian studies. Educators used it to illustrate the ethical and psychological complexity of industrial-era Appalachia, emphasizing the interplay between survival, morality, and power. The town's enduring presence in cultural memory demonstrates the ways historical events, particularly those involving human suffering and ethical compromise, can persist in consciousness long after physical structures vanish. Ultimately, Grey Hollow's story is a meditation on the long-term consequences of human action, the persistence of memory, and the moral obligations owed to both people and place. The widow who sold her daughters, the miner who exploited labor and authority, and the community that navigated fear, silence, and complicity all leave lessons embedded in the landscape and psyche of the region. The earth itself, with its collapsed shafts, fragmented bones, and scarred ridges, serves as a repository of moral reckoning. Visitors, descendants, and scholars alike encounter not only the tangible history of mining and industrial exploitation, but also the ethical and emotional weight of decisions made under duress. Grey Hollow endures not as a town of homes and stores, but as a complex intersection of geography, memory, morality, and trauma. Its mountains hold the traces of desperation, coercion, and survival, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. The human and environmental echoes of Clara Mayfield's choices, Hollis Crane's authority, and the miner's labor reverberate through the land, through stories, and through generations. The town, though physically erased, persists as a warning. The consequences of power, exploitation, and moral compromise are not confined to a single moment. They endure, inscribed in both memory and earth, shaping the consciousness of those who come after. Grey Hollow, in this sense, is more than a ghost town. It is a living testament to the interplay of human action, ethical complexity, and the memory of lives sacrificed to circumstances beyond their control. And so, the mountains, the hollows, the creeks, and the scarred earth continue to hum with the stories embedded within them. The wind carries fragments of lullabies, whispers of labor, and echoes of grief. The soil, disturbed by mining and human desperation, holds fragments of bone and artifact, visible to those who know where to look. Visitors, scholars, and descendants alike confront the persistent presence of Grey Hollow, not as a place frozen in time, but as a living repository of moral, historical, and emotional memory. It is a reminder that the choices made under duress and the systems that enable them leave traces that cannot be erased. The earth itself becomes a witness, a chronicler, and ultimately, a caution. In reflecting on Grey Hollow, one must recognize that the story is not simply about Clara Mayfield, her daughters, or Hollis Crane. It is about the conditions that shape human behavior, the ethical dilemmas imposed by systemic inequities, and the enduring consequences of desperation and exploitation. The narrative challenges observers to consider the intersections of power, morality, and survival, and to understand that history is not merely a catalog of events but a living, breathing archive, one that resides in people, memory, and the land itself. Grey Hollow remains a potent reminder that the past is never fully gone, that memory persists in subtle, enduring ways, and that human action, in all its complexity, leaves indelible marks upon the world.